Imagine an era when the very heart of Christendom was torn asunder. The Great Western Schism didn't just divide the Church. It exposed its festering wounds, transforming the sacred Holy See into an arena for political machinations and personal ambitions. In this crucible of chaos, where popes disputed each other's legitimacy and loyalty was dictated solely by self-interest, a man emerged whose fate became the epitome of that time's depravities. His name was Balthasar Cossa. His ascent to the pinnacle of ecclesiastical power seemed unfathomable, and his fall, though inevitable, was no less shocking. His biography is not merely a chronicle of a pontiff's life, but a mirror of an age, reflecting the full depth of moral decay and unprecedented intrigue. He was the one who dared to challenge established norms, only to plunge them deeper into ruin. We will trace his path to the papal tiara, uncovering the true cost of power in a world that had forgotten piety. Balthasar Cossa was born in the turbulent lands of the Kingdom of Naples, amidst the fervent passions of southern Italy. His noble but not wealthy background only fueled his ambition, shaping a character as volatile and unpredictable as the waves of the Tyrrhenian Sea. Legends, and perhaps bitter truths, whispered of his youth spent not within monastery walls, but on the deck of a pirate ship, engaging in plunder and violence. This harsh school of the sea and lawlessness hardened his will, sharpened his cunning, and instilled the ruthlessness that would later become his hallmark. 14th-century Naples was a cauldron of intrigue, conspiracies, and violence, where only the most adaptable and unscrupulous survived. It was in such a world that the future pontiff was forged, a man whose ambitions knew no bounds, and whose moral principles were as fleeting as the morning mist. He was not destined for a quiet life. His path was predetermined to be a whirlwind, sweeping everything aside on his way to power. These same qualities, honed in his youth, he would skillfully apply in the service of those already occupying the apostolic see, demonstrating outstanding abilities in administration and in enrichment. Cossa quickly became indispensable to Pope Boniface IX. He was the shadow architect of papal policy, influencing all decrees and anathemas. Under his influence, the chancery transformed into a thriving market. Every ecclesiastical office, every position, acquired its clearly established price. Cossa masterfully devised fiscal schemes, mercilessly squeezing funds from the bled-dry church, filling the papal treasury, and of course, his own pockets. The piratical cunning, forged in his youth, now found sophisticated application in church diplomacy. This unprecedented power, built on avarice and cynicism, elevated him and laid the foundation for boundless personal might. Such concentrated power inevitably breeds temptation. Cossa's new height of authority also meant new opportunities for personal enrichment. He placed his own people in key positions, not shying away from using church revenues to finance his own ambitions and needs. His palace intrigues often intertwined with his personal escapades. The name of Yandra, one of his many mistresses, was whispered throughout Rome, adding another scandalous detail to his reputation. When the powerful Colonna clan attempted to challenge his authority, Cossa responded with cold-blooded cruelty, suppressing the conspiracy and orchestrating a public execution. This episode not only cemented his dominance, but also showed that Balthasar Cossa had become an indispensable, yet extremely dangerous figure, capable of any measure to preserve and multiply his influence. Cossa, this shadow architect of papal power, whose hands were stained not only with gold but with blood, could not remain unrewarded. His stranglehold on Rome, his ruthlessness in suppressing opponents, and his ability to turn any situation to his personal advantage made him indispensable. And so, in 1402, at the mere age of 37, Balthasar Cossa reached the pinnacle. The man whom rumor accused of piracy and extortion, who was known for his questionable connections and blatant immorality, was elevated to the rank of cardinal. The cardinal's mantle fell upon the shoulders of a man whose biography was a succession of scandals and political intrigues. His youth for such a high position was astonishing, especially against the backdrop of his already accumulated baggage of vices and immoral deeds. This was a reward not for piety, but for power, for the ability to manipulate and suppress. Rome, it seemed, had finally bid farewell to any illusions of sanctity when such a character received the purple, ready to unleash his true nature on new territories. No sooner had he received the cardinal's red hat than Balthasar Cossa immediately transformed Bologna, his new residence as papal legate, into a personal kingdom of indulgence. The city, destined to be a strategic outpost of the Church, under his rule became a witness to unprecedented luxury and debauchery. His feasts surpassed those of kings, and his nights were filled with wild revelry, where morality and decorum were cast aside. Yet behind this facade of ostentatious grandeur lay a truly bottomless abyss of vice. The chronicler Dietrich von Nehm, who personally observed Cossa, did not mince words, describing his deeds as unheard of. He directly accused Cossa of debauchery, incest, and violence, asserting that he defiled nuns, raped married women and virgins, not even shying away from sacrilege. Bologna, under his command, became a hotbed of sin, where the papal legate acted as an absolute monarch, whose will was law and whose lust was the driving force. His rule was not merely a series of scandals. It became a demonstration of how boundless power, in the hands of a man without moral principles, can completely distort the purpose of spiritual office. However, this period was not solely one of unbridled hedonism. In the shadow of feasts and orgies, more pragmatic, albeit no less cunning, plans were maturing. Bologna, however, was merely a starting point for Cossa's boundless ambitions. His military genius, so unexpected for a man of the cloth, manifested itself fully. He not only ruled but conquered. Under his leadership, papal troops, reinforced by mercenaries, and even such infamous figures as the pirates Ranieri Guindigi and Guindaccio Buonaccorsi, subjugated Reggio and Parma. Cossa acted not only with the sword, but with an astute mind, masterfully weaving webs of intrigue, deception, and betrayal. For him, promises and oaths were merely temporary tools, to be discarded as soon as they ceased to serve his purpose. This ruthless pragmatism, bordering on cynicism, only strengthened his position, making him a figure to be reckoned with by all. His influence grew, overshadowing even nominal pontiffs. In the midst of these intrigues, as Bologna flourished under Cossa's rule and Rome remained merely a puppet in his hands, the hour arrived that marked a new turn in his ascent. In 1406, Pope Innocent VII, whose health had long been failing, suddenly died. And although the official version spoke of natural causes, whispers from the pontifical curia, like poisonous ivy, entwined around the name of Cardinal Cossa. Could it be that he, a master of backroom deals and ruthless elimination of obstacles, had once again played a hand in a fateful outcome? It was rumored that the Pope's ailment was merely hastened by a skillful dose of poison. For Balthasar, who knew no moral barriers on his path to power, the Pope's death was not a tragedy, but a strategic move that cleared his way. By eliminating the last, however insignificant, nominal ruler of Rome, Cossa definitively secured his status as the undisputed arbiter of the Church's fate. His influence became almost limitless, his ambitions bottomless. It was at this moment, with the papal see once again vacant, that a new chapter in the history of his immoral greatness opened. After the sudden demise of Innocent VII, whose death, as rumor whispered, was not accidental, the Church found itself at a crossroads once again. But for Balthasar Cossa, it was merely another step towards the summit. The conclave of 1406, convened to elect a new pontiff, was less an act of divine providence than a demonstration of his boundless power. Every cardinal, every vote, was weighed and calculated in his ruthless mind. And when the aged Venetian Angelo Correr emerged from the Sistine Chapel, taking the name Gregory XII, the true architect of this choice was evident. The new pope, like a puppet, was entirely dependent on his powerful patron. Cossa, whose hands were stained with blood and gold, was now firmly established as the most influential cardinal, his word law for the Holy See. His influence extended far beyond the curia, yet even such a mighty regent would soon feel attempts to loosen his grip. Initially, Gregory XII, the elderly pontiff, seemed to completely submit to the will of his creator. Balthasar Cossa, a skillful puppeteer, held the Venetian firmly on a leash, effectively governing the Church from behind his back. However, over time, perhaps under the pressure of his own conscience or the realization of the full extent of his puppet-like position, Gregory began to make timid attempts to break free from this suffocating tutelage. He sought to loosen Cossa's grip, and the most obvious step was the pontiff's intention to appoint new cardinals, men whose loyalty would be directed to him and not to his omnipotent legate. This maneuver, designed to undermine Cossa's dominance in the Sacred College, only exacerbated the already strained relations, foreshadowing an inevitable clash between two titans of will. The tension between the puppet and its master reached its climax. Gregory XII, attempting to break free from the grasp of his audacious cardinal, took a desperate step. He excommunicated Balthasar Cossa, stripping him not only of all ecclesiastical rights, but also of his status as papal legate. This was a blow intended to utterly destroy Cossa's influence, but it only ignited the flames of his ambition. In response to the papal curse, Cossa, with characteristic audacity, declared himself the absolute ruler of all territories under his de facto control. He did not merely reject the Pope's authority, he challenged the entire church hierarchy, demonstrating that his power rested not on blessings but on force and political will. All those dissatisfied with Gregory XII's rule, cardinals, princes, cities, weary of the prolonged schism and the pontiff's avarice, immediately began to rally around him. Cossa skillfully used this discontent, transforming it into a tool to achieve his own ends. This confrontation was merely a prelude to a far grander plan that was brewing in the mind of this cunning cardinal. Having rallied legions of discontented individuals, Balthasar Cossa proceeded to implement a grandiose plan. His strategic genius was fully revealed in the organization of the Council of Pisa in 1409. The colossal preparatory work and masterful diplomacy were his doing. He skillfully manipulated the cardinals, convincing them to depose both pontiffs, Gregory XII and Benedict XIII, and elect a single head of the church. The most brilliant move followed. Instead of ascending the papal throne himself, to which all his ambitions seemed to lead, Cossa declined this opportunity. He supported the election of the elderly Pietro Filarchi, who became Alexander V. This seeming altruism was, in fact, a display of profound strategic calculation. Cossa did not yield the throne, but merely appointed a compliant instrument, retaining real power and control over the papal treasury. It was a chess endgame where he set up a multi-move sequence, anticipating every next step. His influence over the new ecclesiastical structure became absolute. But even at this peak, fate had a meeting in store for him, capable of intertwining the threads of his past with his present. The Council of Pisa in 1409 solidified Balthasar Cossa's position as the de facto arbiter of the Church's destiny, even though the elderly Alexander V formally ascended the throne. It was in this cradle of intrigue, 18 years later, that fate once again brought him together with Ima. This unexpected reunion in Pisa became a rare respite for Cossa, known for his ruthlessness and calculating nature. Amidst the turmoil of the papal court and political machinations, they created their own small, almost idyllic world. The cardinal, the shadow ruler, allowed himself the luxury of genuine affection and his longtime beloved once again found her place beside the most powerful man in Italy. However, this fragile peace was merely the calm before the storm, for the shadow of the past and envy were already closing in, threatening to destroy the only happiness Cossa seemed to have dared to allow himself for the first time. Balthasar's reunion with Ima at the Council of Pisa could not go unnoticed. Yandra, his longtime mistress, whose devotion bordered on madness, could not bear such an insult. Like a shadow, she pursued the lovers, gathering evidence of their affair. Her jealousy, fueled by years of cohabitation with the cardinal, turned into deadly hatred. Soon after the council, as Ima enjoyed a false sense of calm, a daring assassination attempt was made on her. A hired killer, under the cover of night, broke into her chambers, but Ima miraculously escaped death, suffering a serious wound. The attacker was caught red-handed. Under torture, he broke, screaming the name of the one who ordered this bloody deed. The Zakashitsa, patroness/client, turned out to be Yandra, burning with a thirst for revenge and unwilling to share her powerful patron. This incident foreshadowed even more sinister events, whose shadows were already gathering over the papal court. Yandra, the former mistress who dared to raise a hand against Ima, proved to be merely a pawn in Cossa's cruel game. Her audacity cost her life. Shortly after the assassination attempt on Ima, Yandra herself fell victim to a mysterious illness, which many, not without reason, attributed to poison skillfully administered at the cardinal's command. But far more sinister was the coincidence. On the very day Yandra breathed her last, Pope Alexander V also died. The sudden death of the pontiff, who was under Cossa's complete control, immediately gave rise to a wave of rumors. Popular gossip whispered of poisoning, and all threads led to one man, Balthasar Cossa. Alexander V's death, in the opinion of many, removed The last, albeit nominal, barrier on the path to absolute power. The path to the papal throne, it seemed, was cleared of anyone who could stand in the way. After a series of deaths that so conveniently cleared his path, Balthasar Cossa stood on the verge of triumph. On May 17, 1410, a conclave of cardinals gathered in Pisa, convened to elect a new pontiff. The air was charged with anticipation and fear, for everyone present understood perfectly whose will would now determine the fate of the Holy See. The cardinals, many of whom owed their positions to Cossa, and others who simply feared his ruthlessness, could not help but feel the oppressive shadow of his influence. He, a man whose hands were stained with blood and debauchery, whose career had paved its way through intrigues and betrayals, was now the undisputed favorite. This was not merely the election of the head of the Church. It was the inevitable ascent of a predator to the summit, predetermined by his own will and the elimination of all obstacles. On May 17, 1410, broken by pressure and intimidated by Balthasar Cossa's unyielding will, the cardinals of the Pisan conclave unanimously elevated him to the throne of St. Peter. He took the name John XXIII, although an official John XXIII already existed in the history of the papacy. This choice may have been a bold hint at succession from that very, now half-forgotten pontiff, or perhaps simply another demonstration of disregard for established canons. Upon ascending the throne, the newly appointed pope immediately set about doing what he did best, restoring the depleted treasury. Decades of schism and endless intrigues had turned the papal curia into a financial ruin, but John XXIII, like no other, possessed the art of profit extraction. For him, the papal throne was not so much a spiritual ministry as a tool for acquiring boundless power and immense wealth, and he already knew how to obtain them. The newly appointed pontiff, John XXIII, wasted no time. He immediately set to work, reviving a practice that had made his predecessor, Boniface IX, equally rich, the sale of salvation. He established clear tariffs for the remission of sins, transforming repentance into a commodity and God's mercy into a price list. For murder, even for sacrilege, forgiveness could be obtained if the sum was large enough. Adultery, bestiality. Any vice had its price in gold. The papal treasury, depleted by years of schism, now filled at an incredible rate, but the pope's personal fortune grew even faster. Each sin remitted, each indulgence sold. It was another gold coin falling into Cossa's insatiable coffers. This unprecedented commercialization of spirituality revealed the true depth of his cynicism. However, his ascension to the throne did not signify a change in course for Cossa. On the contrary, it merely afforded him unprecedented opportunities to realize his ambitions. The Church, in his hands, transformed into a colossal financial mechanism, and spirituality became mere currency. He not only continued, but significantly expanded the system of selling indulgences and ecclesiastical offices, turning the papal curia into a gigantic marketplace where every grace had its price. His cynicism was immeasurable. For John XXIII, the papal tiara was not a symbol of pastoral ministry, but a crown granting absolute power and untold riches. Spiritual dogmas and moral principles were for him merely a facade, behind which lay an insatiable craving for personal gain. This unprecedented avarice became his main driving force, determining every decision, every step. And while holiness was being sold and the treasury replenished, his personal indulgences remained untamed. However, boundless avarice and cynicism were but one facet of his bottomless depravity. Chroniclers, mincing no words, attributed sins to John XXIII that make the soul shudder. Accusations of incest with his own sister, and then his mother, sounded not merely as slander, but as grim echoes of his true, perverted nature. But the pinnacle of his moral degradation was the story of young Dinorah, his 14-year-old granddaughter, who became a victim of the pontiff's insatiable lust. For 2 years she remained in his embrace, a prisoner of perverted passion, her innocence trampled by power and vice. This shameful union was kept secret, but its shadow fell upon John's every step, revealing the true face of one who should have been a shepherd of souls. Yet even Dinorah was merely a pawn in his grand game, a tool for achieving even more sinister political ends. Having ascended the papal throne as John XXIII, Balthasar Cossa continued to weave a web of intrigues, knowing neither shame nor compassion. His cynicism reached its peak in one of the most cold-blooded acts, which shocked even hardened contemporaries. Desiring to eliminate his political opponent, the powerful Ladislaus, Cossa stopped at nothing. The calculation was devilishly simple and horrifying. He poisoned his own granddaughter to frame and discredit Ladislaus, accusing him of this monstrous crime. Evidence indicates that 300 ducats were paid to the apothecary for this deadly deed, the price of an innocent life and political gain. This episode definitively clarified everything, demonstrating that for Cossa, there were no moral boundaries, no sacred things, except power and personal profit. His path to the summit was paved with bodies and betrayed ideals, and his reputation, so carefully hidden behind papal regalia, now threatened to collapse under the weight of these and many other accusations that would soon be presented to the world. On November 16, 1414, the majestic gates of the Council of Constance opened, heralding the beginning of an epoch-making assembly intended to heal the fractured church. Presided over by John XXIII himself, whose presence was simultaneously a sign of hope and a harbinger of storm, not only the expectation of reforms, but also ominous whispers hung in the air. Rumors of countless sins and misdeeds attributed to the pontiff multiplied daily. From accusations of piracy and trafficking in church offices to testimonies of cold-blooded murders and monstrous debauchery, every step Balthasar Cossa took on his path to the papal throne was marked by blood and vice. It was here, within the walls of the council, that the fate not only of the divided church, but also of the man who dared to take the name John XXIII was to be decided. As delegates flocked to Constance, not only did anger against his actions grow, but also the understanding that this spectacle could not end peacefully. Clouds gathered over the pontiff's head, portending inevitable retribution and a desperate attempt to avoid it. The rising wave of accusations, like a tsunami, threatened to engulf the pontiff. John XXIII, whose reputation hung by a thread, keenly felt the precariousness of his position. It was clear to him. The Council of Constance, which he himself had convened, had now become a trap. On the night of March 20, 1415, under the cover of darkness, he secretly fled the city, disguised in plain clothes. His path led to Schaffhausen, under the protection of Frederick IV of Austria, Duke of Tyrol, who, it was rumored, was his accomplice and longtime friend. Cossa calculated that his sudden disappearance would paralyze the council, forcing its dissolution, and provoke a schism between the council and Emperor Sigismund. He believed that this audacious act would buy him time to maneuver, regroup, and dictate his terms. However, his calculation proved as audacious as it was naive in the face of the growing determination of those who yearned for his downfall. How much effort it took for the negotiators to even make him consider the possibility of abdication. In Schaffhausen, where John XXIII had fled, he was overtaken by envoys from the Council of Constance. Their goal was to persuade the pontiff to abdicate, which would be a decisive step towards healing the church's schism. However, Cossa, even cornered, remained true to himself. His conditions for abdication were shockingly brazen and greedy. He demanded not only the retention of Bologna, his personal fiefdom, but also a lifelong cardinalate, secured with a colossal income. But the most outrageous of his demands was an indulgence for all sins, both those committed in the past and those yet to come. This was a cynical mockery of the very idea of repentance and the sanctity of the papal throne. In these absurd demands, Balthasar Cossa revealed his true, unprincipled face, ready to trade everything for power and wealth. But at this critical moment, when it seemed that chaos would engulf everything, Emperor Sigismund entered the scene. His resolve proved unshakable. Without delay, he declared war on Frederick IV of Austria, who was harboring the fugitive pontiff, and excommunicated the duke, plunging him into the abyss of ecclesiastical censure and political isolation. John XXIII, once so powerful, and his patron Frederick, now both outlawed and deprived of all support, were forced to flee, abandoning everything to fate. The irony of fate. The Pope, accustomed to luxury and power, was now a wanderer. However, contrary to all of Cossa's expectations and calculations, the council, deprived of its head, did not dissolve in confusion. On the contrary, it continued its work, preparing for new, even more shocking testimonies that were yet to be heard. While the fugitive pontiff fruitlessly sought refuge, the Council of Constance, despite his audacious desertion, inexorably dispensed justice. Each session transformed into a formidable tribunal, where one by one, monstrous testimonies about Balthasar Cossa's deeds came to light. The interrogations of witnesses, once intimidated or bribed, now revealed the abyss of his vices. The testimonies were so horrifying, so disgusting in their frankness, that even seasoned ecclesiastical investigators did not dare to fully record them in the official indictment. Some details, in their opinion, could desecrate the very parchment. It was the unmasking of a man whose existence seemed woven from every conceivable sin, whose personal life exceeded the darkest fantasies, and whose career was inextricably linked to violence and depravity. The audacious flight of John XXIII, intended to paralyze the council, turned into a collapse. Soon after his hasty retreat, he was captured in Fribourg, a city that was supposed to be his refuge, but instead became the site of his humiliation. The council, unfazed by his defiance, immediately convened a special session. There, in an atmosphere of stern resolve, John XXIII was stripped of all his rights, papal regalia, cardinal privileges, even the very name that once symbolized supreme authority. The final court decision, sounding like a verdict on an entire era of vice, branded him an incorrigible sinner, immoral libertine, thief, murderer, incestuous, and most dreadful for the Church, a disturber of peace and unity. Now, with his name erased from the annals of the papacy, and his sins publicly condemned, he had no choice but to come to terms with the new reality that awaited him beyond the walls of the council hall. Stripped of his name and office, the deposed pontiff, once the all-powerful Balthasar Cossa, found himself a prisoner. He was initially confined within the gloomy walls of Gottlieben Castle, where dampness and meager rations were only part of his trials. Worse than the physical deprivations was the language barrier that cut him off from the outside world, turning each day into a torment of solitude. He was soon transferred to Mannheim, but the conditions of his imprisonment remained severe. During these dark times, his only solace, an inexhaustible source of hope, was the loyal Ima. This woman, who dared to share his disgrace and fate, not only supported his spirit but also worked tirelessly, employing bribery and cunning to alleviate the plight of the once mighty captive. Her devotion was astonishing, and it was she who prepared the ground for events that seemed unimaginable. Yet, even in captivity, stripped of his former grandeur, Balthasar Cossa was not broken. His faithful Ima entered into secret negotiations with Elector Ludwig III. The price for the deposed pontiff's freedom was a colossal sum of 50,000 florins, money that Ima, with incredible persistence, managed to raise. Freed, the once all-powerful, now simply Balthasar Cossa, finally set foot on Italian soil. He made his way to Florence, where the newly elected Pope Martin V awaited him, whose election at the Council of Constance had deposed Cossa. The meeting of the two former rivals was full of hidden meanings. Balthasar humbly knelt and begged for forgiveness. And a marvel of politics or mercy, Martin V not only granted forgiveness, but also restored Cossa to the honorary title of Cardinal Bishop of Frascati, presenting him with the red hat. This was truly an incredible turn in the fate of a man who had recently been branded as the embodiment of all sins. After all his downfalls and hardships, Balthasar Cossa did not abandon attempts to recover his former fortune. He approached Giovanni de' Medici, head of the prosperous Florentine banking house, demanding back the vast sums entrusted to him. But Medici, whose shrewdness matched his business acumen, responded with an emphatic refusal. These funds, amassed through debauchery, simony, and intrigue, formed the foundation of the legendary wealth that allowed the Medici house to ascend to unprecedented power and influence, becoming a shadowy beneficiary of papal sins. Deprived of his last hope, Cossa spent the remainder of his days in Florence beside his loyal Ima. There, far from palaces and battlefields, on December 22, 1419, he met his death. Thus concluded the earthly story of Balthasar Cossa, a man whose name became synonymous with the profoundest vices and audacious ambitions in the history of the papacy, a figure who forever left an indelible, scandalous mark on the face of the Church. But the history of his era was not limited to mere ecclesiastical intrigues.